Welcome to the Way of Biohacking. Today is Christmas Eve, and welcome. We have Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda, Nutritionist Yogini. What's up?
And
hi everyone, it's Nikki, wellness intern.
And today's topic is trauma. Trauma. Nikki, do you want to start us off today?
Well, today is a traumatic day for me. It's an anniversary of someone I knew who passed away when I was in high school with them. So a few friends of mine, we got together and we were at the cemetery this morning. I think I told you.
Yeah. So
this is an appropriate topic. It's a good one to address for me right now because I'm currently, thinking about that type of stuff.
Okay. Linda?
Yeah, before we came together to start recording, we talked about let's keep it light.
Yeah.
Because trauma affects people in many different ways, and people experience trauma on many different levels.
Yeah.
It could be physical trauma, emotional trauma. I definitely have stories for both. But one of the most traumatic things that happened to me was when I was 15 and I was snowboarding, and I had a really serious tailbone injury that affected me for years later. And even the idea of being on top of a mountain and having to make myself go down is traumatic. It causes this fear in my body where I'm sweating almost. So that's some physical trauma that I've experienced that still to this day causes a visceral reaction in my body.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Me neither. I'm going snowboarding on Sunday.
I hope that might start to traumatize you.
Please be careful. I think one of the traumatic things that I actually overcame was I was still living in Korea as a kid. So I must have been under 6 years old. Chances are I was more like 4 years old. And at the dinner table, I was eating fish, and my parents were busy eating their own fish. And so I ate a piece of fish, but it had a piece of bone, and it got caught in the back of my throat, and I started gagging, and I ended up spitting out the food. And in Asian culture, that's so disrespectful. And my dad yelled at me on top of that. So no one asked me if I was okay. Instead, I got yelled at. And I think because of this event, I ended up having this aversion to eating seafood. So if I smell seafood, I would get nauseous. But I could still eat raw seafood. But if it was cooked seafood, that's distinct smell, whether it's in soup or fish being cooked or grilled. I started having this gag reflex, and just the smell of it, I was I don't want to eat that. I feel sick. I feel, And I overcame that when I was 15 years old, because my parents opened up a Korean restaurant in K-Town, 32nd Street, and everyone raved about the maeuntang, the spicy fish soup, and they said try it, and I was but you know what, just on my own, I said, you know what, I gotta overcome this, and I started having little by little, and till this day I still don't like to eat fish soup. What is in front of me, right? I'll eat it and not have a gag reflex. That is something I overcame. So I think through that experience, it's important for people to not keep on running away from your traumatic experiences, but to actually deal with it and confront with it and overcome it, because in the end, it will make you stronger, right?
I could relate to something like that. You guys know in October I had an accident at the shooting range. I talked about it on here before, but for about a week I played a lot of video games, and I couldn't play any shooter games. For a week I couldn't play them, and I eventually I was able to work my way up to playing them again, but it was hard. I got a little bit of anxiety when I tried to play them, and I just couldn't do it. I had to wait about a week until I was comfortable again. So I could definitely relate to that.
Yeah, same with the having to work through it. Another traumatic experience, when I was 25 years old, I got into a car accident, and I fell asleep. It was like 4 a.m. I just dropped my friend off at the airport. I was driving back. The highway, thank goodness, was empty. So I hit both barriers. I literally fell asleep at the wheel.
Whoa.
I don't remember what happened because I fell asleep, but I woke up and my car was just, all the tires are blown out and everything. But the scary part was that I didn't know what happened. And how my parents reacted to that was my dad made me drive the next day.
Really?
How was that?
And it was scary at first because I was like, but I understood where he was coming from, where if I didn't take that step, then I would always have this block and this fear of being on the road again because of that accident. So I'm very grateful that my dad pushed me to do that, even though he didn't explain anything. He was just like, you're driving today, even though usually when we're on the car together, he's the driver.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so that was one way I overcame that trauma. But to this day, where it's like, if I feel the slightest bit of sleepiness, I pull over, switch drivers, take a nap, and definitely try not to get back to that place.
I can relate to that. I was in acupuncture school, and I was coming from New Jersey, and I was driving on the Queensboro Bridge, and as you're coming from Manhattan to Queens, they got that sharp right turn, and it was like slippery that day, and I should have braked. That was my fault, and I didn't brake hard enough to get to that point. I was trying to like swerve it, and then my left tire hit that, right, and the car was wrecked and totaled. And I gotta say, I didn't want to drive for a while, and I remember my brother was like next day like driving. I'm like, yo, I don't want to drive right now. Like I got scared. There was like almost like a physical gut reaction, like my body telling me not to drive, right? Because I didn't trust myself. But eventually I'm driving, right? So I would consider that, like, for myself at least, like a very mild trauma where there was like an aversion, right? Do you guys have any other stories to share? I got a couple more, I think.
I've got plenty, but I think I've spoken about them a few times before.
What about you, Linda?
How deep are you trying to go right now?
Well, no, I want to keep it light. I think you right before the podcast you were mentioning this book.
Yeah.
The Body Keeps the Score. Is like the Bible of trauma, and I was reading it, and you just told me about something like EMDR. And I'm like, I don't remember reading that. Well, but what I do remember about the book was, I'm not going to mention on the podcast, but there was some like really deep traumatic stuff that, you know, people experience in war and all the stuff, and it got too dark for me, so I ended up putting it down. But eventually I got to get to it. You know, I guess, like, I just don't like reading about that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So that book, The Body Keeps the Score, is recommended by a lot of yoga teachers and for a lot of yoga teacher trainings, which is really interesting because when you're working with somebody, you don't realize how much trauma is stored within your physical self.
Yes.
Like, you might think it just might affect you mentally, emotionally, but a lot of times people say, like, oh, when you do hip openers, they help release a lot of stress, a lot of sadness, or some people get into pigeon pose and just cry uncontrollably. And that has a lot to do with how your body stores your trauma. So that's something interesting as a yoga teacher in learning working with bodies, and why some people have so much difficulty achieving certain poses is because there might be trauma that might have happened to them at some point in their life that they haven't accessed or tapped into, or a blind spot that they have, and that's why there's these blockages in achieving these different postures. So
in massage therapy school, because we are taught to massage one muscle at a time, and then you move on to two different, like, your movements become like, okay, I'm massaging this muscle so we know what it feels like, and then we're trying to massage around the area encompassing different muscle groups in the arm or in the leg and so forth. And one of the things that I learned in massage school but not in acupuncture school is on day one of massage, the teachers were saying things like, the emotions are not, like, when we open up a human being, we're like, oh, you know, this is where their muscles are, this is where their heart is, this is where their blood vessels are. But one might think, but where is this person's emotions, right? And some neuroscientists might say, oh, it's in the brain when it fires this part of the area. But how do you explain people saying, oh, I feel it in my gut, I got this gut feeling, right? So is that emotion stored in the guts, right? How is trauma stored in somewhere? So you said you had a tailbone accident, right? So if somebody was to touch that tailbone, perhaps your memory will go back to the mountain and stuff like that, right?
Oh yeah, like that first time we did the light touch technique and the first place you touched was the tailbone. I tightened up because I'm like, I used to have pain there.
Okay.
But then I knew like we were doing this whole light touch technique and there was a process to it, and then I understood I was in a safe place and that I'm not on top of a mountain. I didn't have to make it down. I didn't have to snowboard, and I had to work through the fear. But part of working through the fear is questioning and facing, why am I scared in the first place?
So I'm just curious, because I broke my tailbone 3 times.
Oh wow.
Every year I played basketball. In high school I broke my tailbone during the season. So did you break it, or?
I don't know. My parents, I think at the time, was just like, she just doesn't want to snowboard and she's telling us, but I literally couldn't sit for 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's the same thing with me. I couldn't like ride a bike. I couldn't really sit down, but I could like run. Like I still played the season. Like running was fine, but when I sat down, like I had to like sit like a silly way because it would hurt.
And I had residual pain up until my 20s, and that was when I was 15.
Mine typically went away a few months. It went away like 2 months, 3 months. It went away, but I did break. The second 2 times, I actually got like an X-ray, and like you saw the fracture.
Yeah, but I went to a massage therapist, and they told me like, yeah, your tailbone is definitely crooked. So I got a lot of massage therapy for it. But in Katona yoga theory is very interesting. So different parts of your body correlates with a lot of different ideas. The tailbone is set in your foundation, and it's your base. So if you have a tailbone injury, for example, it's something you might question, like what in your foundation is shaking or falling apart or not serving you at this time. Versus most recently, I was dealing with a right shoulder injury. Your right arm, right shoulder is about reaching out, how you show up in the world, how you reach out in the world. So what was going on in my life then in terms of what was I struggling to lend a hand to or to make a deal with?
One thing I do want to bring up in like a touch therapy, because that's what massage is. Another human being touches you so that you feel better. And most people think like, oh, I just got neck and shoulder issues and stuff like that. But if you really get neck and shoulder problems, people who have like especially shoulder pain, they use prejudice, right, on muscles to identify what this person is really dealing with. So for an example, a person with a lot of shoulder issues, right? They have a lot of responsibilities on the, as they say, the weight of the world on your shoulders, right? People who are inflexible in their views, they have, what is that? Neck problems. They can't turn their heads because they're inflexible in their views, whether it's political, economic, religious, or whatever. They have a strong view on something, so whatever. And those people end up having some sort of neck pain. People with hip problems, they don't make decisions like fast enough. They sit on it for too long. Get it? You sit on it for too long, right? People who have a lot of back problems, and it's usually people who are overworked running their business, like they don't feel supported by their family and their friends or the government or whatever. So like, is it always true? The answer is no, right? But like a lot of the percentage, I would say more than 50% of the time, like people would fit into that description. And who here knows about fascia?
Like muscle fascia?
Yeah.
Okay.
Muscle fascia. Fascia is the clear film around the chicken that you observe at the supermarket, and these clear films wraps around the muscles. But what they really found out is that fascia runs through your muscles, through your brain, through your bones.
It's like a membrane.
Organs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And a lot of people, say, oh, neurology connects to everything, right? We have a person like that, right? But at the same time, fascia, like the cells, the amount of cells in terms of like neurology is in the billions. But the amount of cells that fascia run through the whole body is in the trillions, right? And I think fascia holds a lot of these things because like there's a technique by John F. Barnes, right? The myofascial release techniques. And what he does is that, like, if you have a knot right, like this, right, if you have a knot here and the fascia is all crumpled up and it's creating these creases up the body, and if you work over here, it doesn't get addressed. You have to release where the knot is to undo that. And oftentimes from a neurological standpoint, it's the pain does not travel from the central nervous system down to the periphery, and that's how you know it's nerve pain. But when people like rotate their neck in sideways, they have shoulder like pain from their shoulders, and those are what they call fascial pain. And the person who figured out how to treat that is a lady by the name of Dr. Janet Travell, and she was the medical doctor for John F. Kennedy. But this guy, John F. Barnes, is a physical therapist. He learned how to undo that using techniques, and people would release a lot of emotional feelings. But you would get that from Katona yoga, no? Like people holding postures and then they're able to open up areas.
Yeah, definitely. So in Katona yoga, it's a hatha practice. So people are holding postures for a lot longer amount of time compared to a vinyasa practice. So when people have to hold the postures longer, then a lot of discomfort may arise, and this discomfort may cause an emotional release, such as crying, typically crying, but also like people will just want to get out of the posture as well. That's a common thing as common occurrence.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's something you definitely see a lot in yoga, and other workouts too. Like it's just this huge cathartic release almost sometimes when you're able to access these things.
Let's see. Okay, we talked about various topics about trauma and the science and the physiology behind it. I want to focus this little bit of time to talk about what can people do for the traumas. And one we just talked about, getting massage therapy. The other one is getting, what is that? Yoga, right? But Linda, would you want to start us off? Like what other ways?
Yeah, I want to talk about meditation a little bit, and especially inner child work. That's something that has come up a lot for me recently, especially my mentor. He's been teaching meditation and working in yoga for the second half of his career, I would say. And what he's been doing the most recently is helping people, guiding them through inner child work, which I find is very interesting. Have you all heard of inner child work before?
No, I haven't.
Very little, but I don't know much about it.
So there's an author, I believe his name is John Bradshaw, and he has a book, I think, called Championing the Inner Child. And it has a lot to do with visualizing yourself as an infant, a toddler, a child, going through your tween phase, and basically making a connection with that person that's still inside you. Because even though you're an adult now, you at some point were that child, and then you have to go back. Like, for example, when someone throws a tantrum as an adult, like, why are they acting so childish?
Right.
And then you could go back to like, okay, that's something that would happen typically for like a 2 to 3 year old. What happened to that person when they were 2 to 3 years old that would cause them to react that way, that's triggering them to react now? So having to make yourself go back to those memories and seeing what was happening in your environment around you and your upbringing that causes you to be the way you are today taps into a lot of past trauma that you might have totally blocked off or forgot about or not thought about for many years that formed you into the person you are today.
And it's kind of stemming off of meditation is I like doing like physical activity after mental trauma or physical trauma. Even after what happened to me in October, I went to Long Beach and I did a 12-mile walk. I walked for 12 miles. I walked for like 2.5 hours, but it didn't feel like I walked for that long. I was so like in my own head. I was kind of like meditating as I was walking, like replaying the situation and analyzing it and trying to be comfortable with it. And I ended up walking for 12 miles on Long Beach. And after, when I got to my car, I felt so much better than when I got out of my car to go do the walk. So I'm a fan of even going to the gym also. I feel helps me when I have when I'm really stressed out. or something along those lines.
So what it sounds like you're saying to me is you have a very strong grounding practice, especially the walking on the beach and connecting your body with the earth. And it's something we practiced this morning during our team practice was using sounds and learning how to bring your energy back down. So that's also another grounding practice. And that's something I think it's really important in terms of dealing with trauma too. Just because a lot of times, let's say you are triggered, and you might even feel like a panic attack or something starting to arise. A lot of times it's all in your head. Realizing that first, and then being able to bring that energy back down. So taking a long walk, definitely away, exercising, yoga are all grounding practices to bring yourself back to the present moment, because you are not in that traumatic place that you were before. You are here right now, ideally in a safe space.
One thing I can say of ways to work through your trauma, I've seen people with various sorts of trauma and they had an aversion to whatever activity or place or the event that gave them, but eventually they used that power of overcoming and they became stronger people afterwards, right? I think you and I talked about that last week, and I think there's an important part of the journey for people to overcome that. And they have other tools. Some people use exercise, yoga, meditation, right? But you and I were talking about EMDR, right? I think EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And okay, so I didn't get to. What can you tell us what you read about in that book?
And The Body Keeps a Score, they were talking about this woman who was just simply going on walks with her patients and just having talks with them, and then she would realize how during certain parts of the walks the patients would just avert their eyes in different directions to look at their surroundings, but how that helped them process their trauma. So then she eventually systemized it and made it scientific in terms of having a process in which direction to direct the eyes in treating these patients with trauma.
Nikki, did you get a chance to listen to, who is that, Dr. Huberman talk about EMDR?
No, I do listen to a lot of his stuff though, but I haven't heard that. But that's really interesting. So she would tell people which way to move their eyes?
Yeah, eventually in treatment.
Wow, that's so interesting.
So what I learned from Dr. Huberman, I think I came across EMDR through Dr. Huberman first he was at Mind Valley talk, and Dr. Huberman, I think that was like his debut video in front of a larger audience, and he finally talked to the biohacking community, and the biohacking community is like all interested in this, right? And what, according to that YouTube video, it shows that there were two groups of people. One, as they're talking to their talk therapist, they would come to a point where like, oh my god, like they're about to spill their guts, right, to their therapist and come through a breakthrough in their talk therapy. And there were two groups of people. Group A, they would just look at their therapist or not look at the therapist and then just talk about what happened to them and why they're having traumatic experiences and have an emotional release. Second one was these people would look left and start talking about it, and look right and talk about it. And they found out that group B, the people who would move their eyes to the sides, they somehow recovered faster than the people who were not looking left and right. And Dr. Huberman looked at this research and says, I'm a stress brain, researcher from Stanford. This can't be true. So he threw it out. And then a few months later, another study confirming the study, and he ended up, according to his own words, eating his own words, and he started researching it more and more. And what he found out was that when you look left and right, you're able to turn off the amygdala of the brain, and that's the emotional part of the brain. So, for example, if I went to a wedding and somebody said some snarky things, right? That snarky things, you're at a wedding, you got to be cordial. You can't blow up and ruin the wedding, right? So you just got to be cool. But people would just eat that and go home and, obsess about what they said over and over and over and over. And it's not that much of a big deal. But when I heard about this EMDR, I was like, okay, this memory is triggering me again. So let me look left and think about these things. And what I'm noticing, I'm able to process that memory and turn off the emotions. And it took a longer interval to come about. And what I started noticing is that I would think about these things, but it's not emotionally bothering me. So I started doing with other things, right? Like my car experiences, or going to my meditation and like, oh, well, hey, what other traumatic experiences do you have, right? And start, opening my eyes, looking left, and start thinking about these things. Looking right, thinking about these things. And
do you think that this would be a good way to calm people down during like an anxiety attack?
Yeah,
something along those lines?
Yeah. So I think EMDR is very, very powerful. It's free. You don't need a prescription. You don't need to go pick it up, right? You don't need your insurance card to get it, right? And these are actual like techniques that has been proven through science that these things actually work. And I take the time to explain these things to my patients, and I just posted the Dr. Huberman video on my website and the blog. I'm like, just go watch it. Like, I don't want to explain it to you, right? Next are we done with EMDR? Okay. All right. I think this is the first episode we are actually going to talk about the light touch technique, right? The giving name is, what is that? The Aspire technique, right? Mm-hmm. That's the branding that we're going for. I'll spend another episode with Linda, and hopefully Tom will be there, right? The neuro architect, right? To talk about in depth about what we're trying to do with this technique and evolve it and see what the clinical experience has been. I've seen people in a emotional turmoil state. Like, I'm gonna give two examples. Like, one person was told like you don't have a job, right? The other person was like, we're filing for divorce, right? The other person is someone died in their family. Very extreme cases, not like your everyday type of stress. And I consider this like epic moments for these people's emotional states in their lives. And when I see these people, I would invite them to get this technique done. And what I'm doing is touch people in their tailbone, right? And trying to move cerebrospinal fluid. And it sends this fluid into the brain and opens up, and all this circulation happens, and people end up breathing on their own. And people start releasing a lot of traumatic experiences. I had one woman who was not given any context around this technique, and after getting it done, they would like cry, if you do this on like normal people who don't have trauma, they're like, hey, what's the big deal, right? Mm-hmm. But people who are going through like emotional turmoil, they feel a huge lift. Both of you guys have these sessions, right? Nikki, I'm gonna have you talk about it first. What was your experience going through that?
Well, at first I used to get really tingly in my face, and I would get cold. Now I just feel very clear-headed after. I feel like I did like a session of Wim Hof breathing. Mm-hmm. After. I feel super level, and like I just did an ice plunge or something in my head.
Okay. Did you get any benefits out of like things not bothering you anymore or anything like that?
As far as like rolling off my back and stuff, yeah, a lot of stuff rolls off my back. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's been happening for a little while, but I don't know but yeah.
You're doing a lot of stuff for personal development using biohacking.
Yeah. I do a lot of things.
So the Aspire light touch technique, there's a huge breathwork component in it as well. And for people that haven't practiced breathwork before, being able to access the breath is a very powerful tool to access a lot of other parts of you as well, because you're directing energy to many different parts of your body that might not usually get that type of that attention. And that's similar to holding a yoga pose for a long time. You're guiding the energy to those areas where you're not used to. And that's what I think causes that type of traumatic release. For me personally, this technique, I think I'm very blessed where I've had a lot of tools to help me process a lot of my trauma. And therefore I didn't come into this light touch technique with a lot of underlying trauma. But similar effects to Nikki, where I do feel this clarity afterwards. I always say, like, I just feel like I got out of a therapy session. Yeah, and that's kind of the effects I have, where it's just like there is some type of release, and there's always, I feel very cold afterwards. And Tay always tells me that, oh yeah, you released a lot of anger, and I've been releasing anger for months now, which I don't doubt.
I've seen people's face like come out of there like looking years younger. I've seen
and
brighter, yes. And sometimes people, especially in the beginning stages, like people leave, like go home and like blast off in anger, and because you just open them up and these things are coming out. So I usually give a fair warning. One of the most profound experiences that I've had getting this technique done, especially when I was getting trained, when I came back, it made me more proactive to create or change relationships that I had that was not healthy for me. And I think that was one of the most profound things, and I didn't know it was happening to me because, oh, I got the session done, okay, this is how I felt afterwards, right? But I think what I started doing was rearrange a lot of the relationships in business, personal, and so that it's healthier for me in the long run. And I think that was because I had not like a very strong traumatic experience, but a lot of like little ones, because I dealt with people's toxicity, right? And like, you know, I was always taught be polite and all this stuff, and turns out like being polite and to people, especially who are toxic, is not very healthy, right? So for me, it was very profound in that regard, right?
So you said being nice to people who are toxic isn't healthy?
Well, that comes with a dual-edged sword. I think when people are toxic, right, it is good to be nice to them, but if you're feeding a problem, right, then you would have to identify the problem and not be, you want to be part of the solution, not be part of the problem. And I think toxic people who are causing small increments of trauma into your life and desensitizing you to a lower moral, ethical, professional standard should be kept in touch in healthier dosages, meaning you decrease the amount of time that you see them, and when you see them, you try to keep it light and not get affected by their toxicity. And I think I learned this from the neuroarchitect Tom, right? Telling me that certain relationships are okay to cut off, right? I think that was very profound, because, you know, how do you keep relationship with a person who's truly toxic, right?
That's a very interesting point of view. I've never really thought of it like that. And what Tom said, I think that's important also, is to kind of filter who you associate yourself with. I think it'll definitely help with trauma, especially if there's trauma associated with certain people. Just, you know, be polite. I like to, you know, still take the high road and be nice, but you could still be nice, but just kind of decrease the time that you'll spend with them.
Right. So you decrease the contact time that you have with these people.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. And it's not just so much being nice, but also I think relating to last week's episode on perspective, is having compassion for others. And building a compassion practice and seeing where other people come from. And I think that goes for people that bring a lot of toxicity into your life, or people dealing with trauma. Just being able to have that compassion to understand that everyone suffers, everyone has trauma, everyone experiences to a different degree, and it's all relative, but everyone suffers from this. And being able to understand that and come from a place of loving kindness, and sometimes the loving kindness means that you have to spend less time with them.
And sometimes it takes spending less time with them for you to realize how they were negatively affecting your life. Like, you might think, sometimes you're in a relationship, say, and you think it's all great, and then you get some time away and you realize, maybe this is what's best, is time away. And it takes that to realize that maybe you're better off without that person.
Yeah, they say like the 5 people that you spend the most time with, like, you become part of them, and they become a part of you. And I definitely see that. But toxic people is one of those things that are very, very difficult to deal with, because oftentimes you may have a toxic member of your family.
Right.
Friends you can choose, but family members you can't, right? And some cultures believe that, but they're still your family. They are still your family, and that gives people an excuse to continue their toxic ways. And I think culturally people are taught to learn to deal with them, but from a professional level, when people are seeking help, I think that's not really culture yet, right? And these people teach people, like, it's okay to cut these relationships off because they're so toxic, and because you can't say you got to live with the bully for the rest of your life, and have you guys watched the Netflix special called The 13 Reasons Why?
Oh, I've heard about that.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that show. When it came out, I was in like 10th grade. I think I watched it.
I watched it because my wife heard about it from her friends, and like when I heard like a bunch of teenagers talking about it, I'm like, whatever. I think season 1 was the best.
It was definitely the best, but I didn't like it that much because I was in high school at the time.
Yeah.
And I felt like the depiction of what high school was like, and like bullying, I guess, wasn't very accurate.
Yeah.
I know it's different everywhere, but to me, I was like, that stuff doesn't really happen. But I mean, every school is different, but for me, I couldn't relate to it that well.
I think, they try to put all the high school problems into a bunch of kids to experience that in one shot. I think that's where the unrealistic, good drama.
Yeah, it was entertaining.
1. But season 2, season 3, like, didn't do it for me. I was just like, okay.
Yeah, me neither. Right now. Me neither.
Something that's really popular these days in, I guess, like the therapy world is learning how to break intergenerational trauma.
Okay.
And that's something that comes up a lot in terms of why are we the way we are. It's because we're raised by our parents who suffered from these issues, who were raised by by our grandparents who suffered from whatever issues, and then these traumas get passed on generation to generation. Then now, like, millennial Gen Z is really the population that's really like, I want to break from this trauma. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to do the work. And there's many different ways to do the work. You go to therapy. You could do meditation practices, self-reflection practices that help peel away the layers and take away all the things that condition us, so that you are you, as opposed to everything that conditioned you to become the way you are.
Like, I really like that, because if I look at like what my parents did wrong raising me and what I'm doing wrong raising my 7-year-old daughter, right, I can say that my parents did their best with what they had, and so am I, right? And that's the intention of raising a child, right? You're doing what you think is best. However, as a parent, you don't know if you're creating trauma, right? They'll grow up and tell you about it, right? Like when I told my dad, like, oh, you yelled at me when I was 4 or 5 years old, and then, and I think that's why I had a gag reflex. Like, he didn't know how to respond to that, right? But I did tell him, like, but it's okay now, and I gave him a hug, and I love you. Especially when I had my daughter, my dad came to me and said, now you know how I felt about you when you were born, right? I was like, oh my God. I just forgave the guy for, like, raising me the wrong way, but at the same time I got to appreciate like how hard he worked to raise me and stuff
that
like
makes me think about something that Tom told me a few months ago, and it really stuck with me. A lot of stuff Tom tells me sticks with me, but he said nobody does like bad things knowing that they're bad. Everyone does things, it might have bad outcomes for some people, but it's what they believe is right for them. And for certain situations, other people might believe that it's bad, but to them it was the right thing. And that, I think that ties in well with parenting.
Yeah.
Sometimes parents might make a mistake, but to them they believe that was the right thing to do, and they could cause a traumatic experience or teach a valuable lesson.
I think if you look at our parents' generation, they were born like post World War II, and then our grandparents' generation was born like they survived through World War II somehow, so they saw a lot of stuff, right? And that traumatic experience gets passed down, and ultimately gets passed down to us. Like if you look at Korean culture, in 1953, when the Korean War ended, there was no infrastructure for government, police stations, or any of these things, and they had to build it from scratch up. And all Korean males had to go to the military, and when they went there between the ages of like 20 and like 24, they weren't taught read a book or whatever. They were hit from the military, like physical hits, so that they can do what is right. So like that's a huge neurofeedback on the society, like through negative conditioning. Like if you do something wrong, we will hit you. And if you look at the generation afterwards, it was okay in Asian culture to hit students in school by the teachers. Oh, you failed. You got a 70. I'm going to hit you 30 lashes for every point that you got wrong. Where 90 kids still got hit 10 times for 10 points, right? Now, fast forward to modern era, these kids don't get hit because over a generation, people realized that this was wrong, right? And I think that didn't stem from like one guy deciding to hit, because I think when you have a country to run and there's all this turmoil and the war just ended and you just need to get things done fast and people hit and yelled and screamed as a poor way of communication, and I think the generational gets passed down, and I think we get to heal from that. But I think one thing that my daughter's generation is going to grow up and realize is that, oh, my parents, they let us watch TV and use all these things, and that was very traumatic. Then if you're listening to this when you're much older, we tried our best not to screw you up.
Yeah, and I think sometimes some forms of discipline doesn't have to be physical discipline, but it could teach valuable lessons. Like when I was misbehaving, my dad would sometimes he'd pull my ear, pull my hair, and I usually think, looking back at it, I probably deserved it. And he never did anything traumatic when I didn't deserve it. Same thing with my brother. He treated us the same way. But when my brother was older, my brother's 4 years older than me, I always looked at it like he got to go out and he got to do things that I couldn't just because I was younger. And at the time, I viewed it like, oh, he gets a special treatment. That's not fair. It's not fair. He's treated better than me. Meanwhile, he was just older. And looking back at it now, I was... They said to me, no, like, he's older. He gets to do this. He gets to do that. But at the time, I thought it was really unfair. Looking back at it now, I realized that I was just acting immature. But if it wouldn't have been smart if they would have let me do the things that he was able to do at my age. So in time, you'll end up realizing, what happened was best.
I like that. My Katone teacher always says everything resolves itself in time. And I think that's true with trauma too. You really do have to give it time, but at the same time, give it work.
I love that. Time. Yeah. I think time showed me a lot of things. All right. We have much more to talk about this topic, but we have to call it a day here. So thank you for listening. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that like button, subscribe, and please share if you can. We'll create more. It's really giving us encouragement to share this content. Create more content like this. So we have a lot of interesting things coming up in 2022. Nikki will be going back to school. But we'll still keep you on the
I'll
podcast.
be here.
Yeah, so he'll still be with us through Zoom or something like that. All right. So, Merry Christmas and have a
happy and a healthy New Year. We will see you. Wait to see what we have in store for the New Year.
Yeah.
All right. Peace.
All right. Take care.